Montana Territory, 1874. Vaughn Xander stared at the orphanage's weathered clapboard as if it were an outlaw pointing a six-shooter at his chest. At 25, he had no business taking on a child. The frontier was no place for sentiment, a lesson branded into him by years of struggle and loss. He adjusted his tan Stetson, squared his shoulders beneath his wool coat, and reminded himself why he'd come. "Just a ranch hand," he muttered, breath fogging in the crisp autumn air. "She's old enough to earn her keep." Spring Creek Ranch needed help, and the orphanage needed one fewer mouth to feed. Simple economics, nothing more. Vaughn had built his cattle operation from nothing after the war, and he wouldn't jeopardize it with softness. His parents' deaths had taught him early that attachment was just heartache waiting to happen. The orphanage matron, Mrs. Holloway, greeted him with practiced enthusiasm. "Mr. Xander, we're so pleased you've considered taking one of our girls. Most ranchers only want boys for labor." "I need someone who can cook and keep house," Vaughn said flatly. "My last ranch hand could burn water." Mrs. Holloway nodded knowingly. "Several of our older girls have excellent domestic skills. Follow me." She led him through narrow hallways, where children scattered at the sight of his tall frame. In the kitchen, 3 girls were working, one kneading bread, another washing dishes, and a third mending clothes by the window. "Girls, this is Mr. Xander. He owns Spring Creek Ranch and is looking for household help." The girl by the window looked up, and Vaughn felt an unexpected jolt. She was older than he'd anticipated, no child but a young woman of perhaps 20. Her chestnut hair was pulled back in a practical braid, and her simple blue dress couldn't hide her graceful posture. There was a quiet dignity in how she set aside her mending and stood. "This is Ruby Whitaker," Mrs. Holloway said. 20 years old and skilled in cooking, sewing, and basic doctoring. She's been with us 6 years now. Ruby Whitaker met his gaze directly, something few men in the territory dared to do. Her eyes were a striking shade of gray, clear and intelligent. "Mr. Xander," she said, her voice steady, "I can cook 3 meals a day, maintain a household, and I learn quickly." Vaughn studied her hands, calloused from work, not soft like a city woman's. She'd be able to handle frontier life, at least physically, but there was something else about her, a guarded wariness he recognized because he carried the same look. "The work is hard," he said bluntly. "Spring Creek is 15 miles from town, just me and 2 ranch hands." She nodded. "I'm not afraid of hard work or isolation, sir. You'd have your own cabin. Small but private." Something flickered in her expression, relief perhaps. That would be suitable. Mrs. Holloway beamed. "Ruby is our most capable girl. She's been waiting for a proper placement." Vaughn noted the quiet dignity with which Ruby endured being discussed like livestock at auction. He'd been in similar positions after his parents died, evaluated for usefulness, not personhood. "Can you ride?" he asked. "Yes," Ruby answered, "and I can shoot, though not expertly." That surprised him. Mrs. Holloway looked uncomfortable. "One of our benefactors believed girls should know basic protection," the matron explained hastily. Vaughn nodded, decision made. "Pack your things, Miss Whitaker. We leave in an hour." As the matron led him to her office to complete the paperwork, Vaughn silenced the voice warning him this arrangement felt different than hiring a ranch hand. He told himself it was simply practical, a business arrangement, nothing more. The legal documents listed him as Ruby's guardian until she turned 21 or married, whichever came first, just 11 months then. He could maintain appropriate distance for 11 months. Ruby appeared promptly with a single worn carpetbag. She wore a threadbare coat and sturdy boots beneath her dress. "That's all you have?" he asked, surprised. "It's all I need," she replied simply. The 15-mile journey to Spring Creek passed mostly in silence. Vaughn wasn't one for idle conversation, and Ruby seemed content watching the landscape, rolling grasslands giving way to pine-studded hills as they approached his property. "There it is," he finally said, pointing to the valley where Spring Creek meandered through cottonwoods. The main house was modest but solid, 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, and a front room. A barn, bunkhouse, and smaller cabin stood nearby, with corrals and outbuildings completing the homestead. Ruby straightened in the wagon seat. "It's beautiful." Vaughn felt an unexpected flash of pride. "Been building it 6 years now." Started with nothing but that cabin you'll be staying in. As they pulled into the yard, his ranch hands emerged from the barn. Hank Davis, a grizzled veteran who'd taught Vaughn most of what he knew about cattle, and Caleb Foster, barely 20 and eager to learn. "Miss Whitaker, this is Hank and Caleb," Vaughn said. "They handle the stock." Ruby acknowledged them with appropriate politeness, neither too familiar nor too distant. Vaughn noticed Caleb's lingering look and felt an irrational twinge of annoyance. "Let me show you your quarters," he said, perhaps more curtly than necessary. The cabin was simple, one room with a bed, table, 2 chairs, and a small stove. He'd built it when he first claimed the land before constructing the main house. Water's from the pump by the kitchen garden, outhouse is behind, meals are at sunup and sundown in the main house. Ruby set her bag on the bed. "Thank you, Mr. Xander." "Vaughn," he corrected. "No need for formality out here." She nodded. "Then I'm Ruby, not Miss Whitaker." He cleared his throat. "I'll leave you to settle in, supper's in an hour." As he walked back to the main house, Vaughn reminded himself again of his purpose in bringing her here. Ranch help, nothing more. The strange lightness in his chest when she smiled was just relief at finding someone competent. That evening, Ruby prepared a simple but satisfying meal from the provisions in his pantry. The men ate with unusual manners, and conversation flowed more easily than it had in months. "This beef's actually edible," Hank marveled. "No offense to your cooking, Vaughn, but this is a blessed improvement." Ruby's mouth quirked up. "I'll take that as high praise, Mr. Davis." "Just Hank, miss, we ain't formal here." "How long were you at the orphanage?" Caleb asked, earning a sharp look from Vaughn for the personal question. Ruby, however, answered easily. 6 years. My parents died of fever when I was 14. "No other family?" Vaughn found himself asking, despite his own rule about avoiding personal matters. "None that claimed me." Her tone remained neutral, but her hands stilled briefly over her plate. The conversation shifted to ranch business, and Vaughn explained their operation: 300 head of cattle, hay fields in the bottomland, and plans to expand next year if prices held. Later, after the hands returned to the bunkhouse, Vaughn found himself lingering in the kitchen as Ruby cleaned up. "You don't need to do all this tonight," he said. "It can wait until morning." "I prefer to finish what I start," she replied, continuing to wash the dishes. Vaughn leaned against the doorframe, studying her profile in the lamplight. "How'd you learn to cook like that?" "My mother taught me basics, the rest I learned at the orphanage." She glanced at him. "Tomorrow I'll inventory the pantry, if that's agreeable." "Do whatever you think best. You know more about running a house than I do." She nodded, then asked, "How long have you been alone here?" The question caught him off guard. "Never thought of it as being alone. Just independent." "There's a difference," she said softly. Vaughn shifted uncomfortably. "Been on my own since 16. Parents died in a raid during the war, worked ranch jobs until I saved enough for this place." Ruby dried her hands. "Then we have something in common, Mr. Xander." "Vaughn," he corrected again. "Vaughn," she repeated, and somehow his name sounded different in her voice. He straightened, suddenly aware of the impropriety of their situation. "I'll let you get some rest. Morning comes early here." As he walked toward his bedroom, Vaughn sternly reminded himself of his conviction: entanglements led to heartache. Ruby Whitaker was his ward and his employee, nothing more. The sooner they both understood that, the better. Yet that night, for the first time in years, the ranch house didn't feel quite so empty. Days became weeks as autumn painted the valley in golds and reds. Ruby settled into life at Spring Creek with a quiet efficiency that transformed the ranch house. Meals appeared on time, the pantry filled with preserved foods for winter, and the drafty rooms became more comfortable with strategic placement of rugs and quilts she'd found neglected in a trunk. Vaughn found himself spending more evenings by the fire instead of riding fence lines until dark. He told himself it was the approaching winter, not the pleasant conversations that awaited him. One evening, as the first snow dusted the ground, Ruby mended shirts while Vaughn reviewed his ledgers. "Caleb mentioned there's a dance in town next Saturday," she said, not looking up from her stitching. Vaughn replied noncommittally. "He asked if I might attend." Vaughn's pencil stilled. "With him?" "With whoever might take me. As my guardian, he thought I should ask your permission." Something uncomfortable twisted in Vaughn's chest. "Do you want to go?" Ruby set down her mending. "I haven't been to a social gathering in 6 years." The implication hung in the air. Her life had been confined to the orphanage and now his ranch. Vaughn felt a stab of guilt. "Then we'll all go," he decided. "The cattle can survive one night." Ruby's smile was worth the disruption to routine. The town of Pine Ridge had swelled since Vaughn's last visit. New construction lined the main street, evidence of the railroad's promised arrival next spring. The dance was held in the newly constructed meeting hall, lanterns casting warm light onto the snowy street. Ruby wore her best dress, dark green wool that brought out flecks of gold in her gray eyes. She twisted her chestnut hair into an elegant knot that made her look older, more sophisticated. Vaughn found himself noticing the graceful curve of her neck, the way her smile transformed her serious face. Inside, fiddle music filled the hall. Vaughn claimed a spot along the wall while Caleb eagerly asked Ruby to dance. She moved with natural grace, her laughter carrying across the room as Caleb led her through a lively reel. "That your ward, Xander?" Sheriff Mills appeared beside him. "Yes, Ruby Whitaker." "Pretty girl. Surprised you haven't married her off yet." Vaughn frowned. "She's not livestock to be traded." Mills raised an eyebrow. "Just saying, a girl like that won't stay unclaimed long out here. 3 men to every woman in the territory." As if to prove his point, Ruby finished her dance with Caleb only to be immediately approached by a well-dressed stranger. Vaughn recognized him as James Elliott, the banker's son, educated back east and newly returned to help his father's business. Something possessive flared in Vaughn as he watched Elliott bow formally over Ruby's hand. He told himself it was merely protective, his responsibility as her guardian. When Elliott led her into a waltz, holding her closer than strictly necessary, Vaughn found himself crossing the floor before he'd consciously decided to move. "May I cut in?" he asked, not entirely politely. Elliott looked annoyed but relinquished Ruby with practiced courtesy. Vaughn hadn't waltzed in years, but his body remembered the steps. Ruby fit perfectly in his arms, her hand warm in his, her waist slender beneath his palm. "I didn't know you danced," she said, looking up at him with surprise. "There's a lot you don't know about me," he replied, guiding her through a turn. "Whose fault is that?" she challenged gently. "You never speak of yourself." The directness of her gaze disarmed him. "Not much to tell." "I disagree," her hand tightened slightly in his. "You built a successful ranch from nothing. You took in an orphan girl with no obligation to do so. Those are the actions of a man with a story worth knowing." Vaughn swallowed, unaccustomed to being seen so clearly. The ranch needed help. "You could have hired anyone. Instead, you went to an orphanage and gave a young woman a chance at independence few get." Her eyes held his. "Why?" The music swelled around them as Vaughn searched for an answer that wasn't too revealing. "Maybe I know what it's like to be judged only for usefulness." Ruby's expression softened. "Then we do have much in common." They danced in silence for several moments, the space between them charged with unspoken understanding. When the music ended, Vaughn reluctantly released her. "Thank you for the dance," Ruby said formally, though her eyes conveyed more. "My pleasure," he replied, meaning it more than he should. The evening continued, and Vaughn found himself watching Ruby constantly, noting how she smiled at elderly Mrs. Peterson, graciously declined Elliott's second invitation, and gently redirected Caleb's obvious admiration. By the time they headed home through gently falling snow, something had shifted between them. Vaughn helped Ruby into the wagon with newfound awareness of her hand in his, the subtle scent of lavender in her hair. "Did you enjoy yourself?" he asked as they left town behind. "Very much." She sat close beside him for warmth. "Thank you for taking me." "We should go to town more often," he found himself saying. "It's not right keeping you isolated at the ranch." Ruby turned to look at him, snowflakes catching on her eyelashes. "I've never felt isolated with you, Vaughn." The simple statement stripped away his careful defenses. In that moment, with moonlight illuminating her face and honesty in her eyes, Vaughn recognized the danger he was in. This woman, his ward, his employee, his responsibility, was becoming something else entirely. And there wasn't a damn thing he could do to stop it. Winter settled over Spring Creek Ranch with relentless purpose. Heavy snows limited travel, turning the ranch into an island of warmth amid a sea of white. The cattle huddled in sheltered draws, Hank and Caleb rotated through feeding duties, and the rhythm of life narrowed to the essentials. For Vaughn, that rhythm increasingly centered around Ruby. Their evenings lengthened as darkness fell early, conversations deepening as they sat before the fire. She asked about his years after his parents' death, and he found himself sharing stories he'd never told anyone, how he'd slept in barns and worked for cruel men until finding Hank, who taught him ranching and treated him like a son. In turn, she spoke of her childhood in Missouri, her father's small farm, and the fever that had claimed both parents in a single terrible week. "The neighbors took our land," she said quietly one evening. "Said they'd purchased it, showed papers my father supposedly signed. I knew it was false, but I was 14 with no proof." Vaughn's hand tightened around his coffee cup. "No one stood for you. My father wasn't well liked. Too educated for some tastes, too outspoken about the war." She looked into the fire. "The sheriff put me on a train to my mother's cousin in Helena, but when I arrived, she'd moved on. The orphanage was my only option." "What would you have done if you'd had a choice?" Vaughn asked. Ruby considered this. "Exactly what I'm doing now, working, building something." She met his eyes. "Having purpose." The simplicity and truth of her answer resonated deeply with him. They were alike in ways he'd never expected, both shaped by loss, both determined to carve meaning from hardship. As December deepened, Ruby surprised him by decorating the house for Christmas, pine boughs on the mantel, red berries in jars, and candles in the windows. "Is this too much?" she asked, hesitating as she hung a small wreath on the door. "I know it's just the two of us, but Christmas was always special in my family." "It's perfect," Vaughn said, realizing he meant it. The house had never looked so inviting. On Christmas Eve, after a dinner more elaborate than anything Vaughn had eaten in years, he presented Ruby with a small package. "It isn't much," he said awkwardly. Ruby unwrapped the paper carefully to reveal a leather-bound journal and a fountain pen. "I noticed you writing sometimes on scraps of paper," Vaughn explained. "Thought you might want something proper." Ruby traced the journal's cover with reverent fingers. "This is the most thoughtful gift I've ever received." She looked up, eyes bright. "How did you know?" "Know what?" "That I want to write stories someday, real ones that people might read." Vaughn hadn't known, but something in him had recognized her need to create, to express the depth he saw in her eyes. "You have stories worth telling." She reached beneath the chair and pulled out a package of her own. "For you." Inside was a dark blue woolen scarf, finely knit with an intricate pattern. "I made it," she said, suddenly shy. "I noticed your old one was fraying." Vaughn ran his fingers over the soft wool. "When did you have time for this?" "Evenings after you go to bed." "It gave me something to do while thinking about the stories I want to write." The idea that she'd spent hours creating something specifically for him, thinking of him as her hands worked the yarn, affected Vaughn more deeply than he could express. "Thank you," he said simply, wrapping it around his neck. "It's perfect." Their eyes met across the small space between their chairs, and for a moment, Vaughn allowed himself to imagine a future where such exchanges were commonplace, where they shared not just a home but a life. The thought should have terrified him. Instead, it felt like coming home after a long journey. Later, as they stood in the doorway saying goodnight, snow falling silently outside, Vaughn found himself unable to step away. "Merry Christmas, Ruby," he said softly. "Merry Christmas, Vaughn," she replied, her face upturned to his. He hadn't planned to kiss her, had told himself repeatedly that it would never happen. But in that moment, with pine scent and firelight surrounding them, it seemed as inevitable as the sunrise. His lips touched hers gently, questioningly. Her hand came up to rest against his chest, not pushing away but steadying herself as she rose slightly on her toes to meet him more fully. The kiss deepened, becoming something neither had anticipated yet both had wanted. When they finally pulled apart, Vaughn saw his own wonder reflected in her eyes. "I shouldn't have done that," he said, though he couldn't bring himself to apologize. "I'm glad you did," Ruby answered with characteristic honesty. "I've been hoping you would." The admission stunned him. "Ruby, I'm your guardian, it isn't proper." "For 11 more months," she reminded him. "And I'm a grown woman who knows her mind." Vaughn took a step back, trying to think clearly. You deserve better than a rough rancher with nothing to offer but hard work and uncertain prospects. That's for me to decide, her chin lifted with quiet determination. Unless you're saying you don't have feelings for me. He couldn't lie, not to her. My feelings aren't the issue, your future is. And what future do you imagine for me, married to someone like James Elliott? Living in town as a shopkeeper's wife, she shook her head. I've seen enough of the world to know what I want, Vaughn, this ranch, this life, she paused, you. The directness of her declaration left him speechless. Part of him wanted to gather her close again to accept the gift she was offering, but the part of him scarred by loss and disappointment held back. We should sleep, he said finally. The morning will bring clearer thinking. Ruby studied his face, then nodded slowly. Good night, then. As she walked toward her cabin, back straight and dignified even in rejection, Vaughn felt as though something precious was slipping through his fingers. But the voice that had guided him for years, the one warning that attachment led only to pain, was still louder than the new voice urging him to follow her. January brought brutal cold and new tension. Vaughn threw himself into ranch work, spending long hours checking cattle and mending equipment. Ruby maintained her duties flawlessly, but the easy companionship of earlier months had given way to careful politeness. The kiss hung between them, acknowledged but undiscussed. When Caleb asked permission to escort Ruby to the New Year's social, Vaughn granted it without meeting her eyes. That night, alone in the empty house, he paced restlessly, imagining her dancing with others, smiling the smile he'd come to think of as his own. He was being a fool, and he knew it. Ruby was young, beautiful, and capable. Any man in the territory would be proud to court her, yet the thought of her with anyone else twisted like a knife. A blizzard in mid-January trapped them all at the ranch for 6 days. Vaughn and the hands worked in brutal shifts to keep the cattle alive, returning to the house half-frozen and exhausted. Ruby kept the fire burning, food ready, and coffee strong. She stitched up Hank's arm when barbed wire caught him, and stayed up through the night when Caleb developed a dangerous fever after too many hours in the cold. On the 6th day, as the storm finally broke, Vaughn watched her gently changing the compress on Caleb's forehead. Her hands were chapped from constant work, dark circles shadowed her eyes from lack of sleep, yet she moved with the same grace that had first caught his attention. You should rest, he said from the doorway. I'll sit with him. Ruby looked up surprised. I'm fine. You're not, you've been caring for everyone else without thought for yourself. He stepped into the room. That's an order, Ruby. Go sleep. Something flashed in her eyes, annoyance perhaps, but she nodded and stood. As she passed him, he caught her arm gently. Thank you, he said softly. We would have been lost without you. For a moment, her composure wavered. I only did what needed doing. No, he countered, you did more, you always do. Their eyes held, and Vaughn felt the walls he'd built beginning to crumble. Ruby looked away first. Call me if his fever rises again, she said, then slipped from the room. That night, after Ruby had retired to her cabin and Hank had taken over watching Caleb, Vaughn sat alone by the fire, turning a small object over in his hands, his mother's ring, the only thing he'd saved from before. Simple gold with a small pearl, nothing fancy or valuable except in memory. He'd been carrying it in his pocket since Christmas, unable to offer it, unwilling to put it away. A knock at the door startled him. He opened it to find Ruby standing there, snow swirling around her, face pale with alarm. What's wrong? He asked, pulling her inside. Smoke, she gasped. From my cabin, I woke to it. Vaughn grabbed his coat. Stay here. He ran through the snow to her cabin, now billowing dark smoke from the chimney and under the eaves. Inside, he found the stovepipe had separated, filling the small space with smoke while she slept. He fixed it quickly, then opened the windows despite the cold to clear the air. When he returned to the house, Ruby was pacing anxiously. It's fixed, he assured her. Stovepipe connection came loose. But the cabin's full of smoke. It'll take hours to clear and warm up again. I can sleep in the barn, she suggested. Don't be ridiculous, you'll take my bed, I'll sleep out here by the fire. She shook her head. I won't put you out of your room. It's not open for debate, his tone softened. You've spent 6 days taking care of everyone else, let someone take care of you for once. The fight seemed to drain from her. All right. Thank you. Later, as Vaughn stretched out on the floor near the dying fire, he heard his bedroom door open. Ruby stood in the doorway, wrapped in a quilt, her hair loose around her shoulders. "I can't sleep," she admitted. "Knowing you're out here uncomfortable while I'm in your bed." Vaughn sat up. "I've slept in worse places." "That doesn't make it right," she hesitated. Would you just talk with me a while? Until I'm tired enough to sleep." It was a reasonable request with an unreasonable effect on his resolve. Nevertheless, he nodded and moved to the chair while she took the one opposite. They spoke quietly about inconsequential things, the weather clearing, the cattle they'd saved, plans for spring planting. Gradually, the conversation shifted to deeper waters. "What frightens you most, Vaughn?" Ruby asked suddenly. He considered deflecting but found himself answering honestly. "Failing, losing everything I've built. The ranch. That and," he looked at her, firelight playing across her features, "other things I might build if I were braver." Ruby's eyes softened with understanding. "What happened at Christmas?" "I behaved improperly," he interrupted. "No," she countered, "you finally behaved honestly and then you retreated." The directness of her assessment left no room for evasion. "You deserve better than what I can offer." "What if what you offer is exactly what I want?" She leaned forward. "I've lived in the orphanage, Vaughn. I've seen what happens to women without choices. You gave me not just shelter but purpose, respect." Her voice lowered. "And then you gave me hope for something more." "Ruby, let me finish." She took a breath. "I understand your fears because I share them. Losing people I love nearly destroyed me once. But living half a life afraid to reach for happiness, that's a slower kind of destruction." Her words struck with the precision of truth, dismantling the justifications he'd built around his isolation. "I've spent 6 years watching girls marry men they barely knew because it was their only chance at security," she continued. "I've had proposals from men who saw me only as a convenience, but with you," her voice softened. "With you I feel seen." Vaughn stood abruptly, moving to the window where moonlight reflected off snow-covered fields. "And what happens when I fail you, when the hard years come, and you realize you tied yourself to a man with nothing but calloused hands and stubborn pride?" He heard her rise and approach, felt her presence behind him before her hand touched his arm. "Those calloused hands built this ranch from nothing," she said quietly. "That stubborn pride kept you going when others would have quit. Those aren't failings, Vaughn. They're why I—" She stopped, then continued with quiet certainty. "They're why I love you." The words hung in the air between them, impossible to take back or ignore. Vaughn turned slowly to face her, searching her eyes for doubt or hesitation and finding none. "Say that again," he requested, his voice rough. Ruby's chin lifted. "I love you. I've loved you since that first night you danced with me and looked at me like I was worth seeing." Vaughn reached out, his hand cupping her cheek with a gentleness that belied the storm of emotion within him. "I've been fighting this since the moment you looked up from your mending at the orphanage." "Then stop fighting," she whispered. This time when he kissed her, there was no hesitation, no holding back. His arms circled her waist, drawing her against him as though she might disappear if he didn't hold tight enough. Her hands slid up his chest to his shoulders, into his hair, each touch igniting something long dormant within him. When they finally broke apart, breathless, Vaughn rested his forehead against hers. "This changes everything." "Only if we let it," Ruby replied. "I'm still me, you're still you. The ranch still needs us both." Her practicality in the face of such emotional upheaval made him smile. "You make it sound simple." "Not simple, but possible." She stepped back slightly, though her hands remained on his arms. "What happens now?" The question demanded an answer he wasn't fully prepared to give. Yet looking at her in the firelight, her trust and love plainly visible, Vaughn knew only one path forward would bring peace. "Now," he said, reaching into his pocket, "I ask you properly." The small ring gleamed in the firelight as he held it between them. "This was my mother's, not valuable, but it meant everything to her." Ruby's eyes widened. "Vaughn, I'm no good with words," he continued, "but I know what I want, and that's you, not as my ward or my housekeeper, but as my wife, my partner." He took a breath. "The mother of my children someday, if you want that." Tears filled her eyes. "I do want that very much." Then marry me, Ruby Whitaker. Help me build something that matters. Yes, she whispered, then louder, yes. The ring fit perfectly, as though it had been waiting for her all along. When he kissed her again, Vaughn felt something final shifting inside him, the last wall crumbling, the last doubt fading. This woman, with her quiet strength and unwavering heart, had done what he'd thought impossible. She'd made him believe in a future worth building together. Morning found them still talking by the rekindled fire, plans and dreams spilling out after years of careful containment. They would marry as soon as arrangements could be made. The legal guardianship would be dissolved with the sheriff's help. Ruby would move into the main house and they would expand it come spring. When Hank emerged from checking on Caleb, he found them sitting closer than propriety strictly allowed, Ruby's hand in Vaughn's, her head on his shoulder. The old cowboy took in the scene, noted the ring on Ruby's finger and grunted, "About damn time." Vaughn laughed, the sound so unexpected it made Ruby smile. That obvious, was it? To everyone but you two, Hank confirmed. Caleb's fever's broken, he'll be disappointed about the engagement, but he'll live. Ruby blushed, we should tell him together. And then town, Vaughn added, make it official with Reverend Thomas. Word spread quickly through Pine Ridge. By the time Vaughn and Ruby met with the Reverend 3 days later, congratulations came from all sides, some sincere, some tinged with envy or speculation. James Elliott approached them outside the church, his manner stiffly formal. "Congratulations, Miss Whitaker, Mr. Xander," he hesitated. "I admit to some surprise at the speed of your arrangement." Before Vaughn could respond, Ruby smiled politely. "When certainty exists, Mr. Elliott, delay serves no purpose. Vaughn and I know our own minds." The banker's son nodded tightly and moved on, but others were not so easily dismissed. Sheriff Mills pulled Vaughn aside while Ruby spoke with the Reverend about ceremony details. "Moving mighty quick, aren't you?" Mills observed. "People might think there's a reason for the rush." Vaughn's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Careful, Mills." The sheriff raised his hands placatingly, just passing along what's being said. "Girl goes from your ward to your wife in a matter of weeks, raises questions. The only question is whether Pine Ridge has enough respect for Miss Whitaker to celebrate her happiness rather than gossip about her character," Vaughn replied coldly. "She deserves better from this town." Mills studied him, then nodded slowly. "You really do love her." "More than I thought possible." "Then I'll make sure the talk stops," the sheriff promised. "As a wedding gift." The ceremony took place 2 weeks later in the ranch house, transformed by Ruby's touch into a place of unexpected beauty. Pine boughs and winter berries decorated the mantels, candles glowed in every window, and a handful of friends gathered to witness the unlikely union of the solitary rancher and the orphaned young woman. Ruby wore a dress of deep blue that Mrs. Peterson had helped her make, her chestnut hair crowned with a wreath of evergreen. Vaughn, uncomfortable in his best shirt and string tie, forgot his discomfort the moment she appeared in the doorway, her eyes finding his across the room. Reverend Thomas spoke of partnership, of weathering storms together, of building something stronger than either could create alone. When he pronounced them husband and wife, Vaughn kissed Ruby with a tenderness that belied the strength of his emotion. The small gathering celebrated with food Ruby had prepared days in advance, and Whiskey Hank contributed from a source he refused to disclose. As evening approached, the guests departed with knowing smiles and good wishes. When the house finally emptied, Vaughn and Ruby stood in the front room, suddenly alone as husband and wife rather than employer and employee. "Are you happy?" he asked, searching her face. Ruby smiled, the firelight catching the gold flecks in her gray eyes. "Happier than I ever imagined possible." She took his hand, her fingers lacing through his. "Are you?" Instead of answering with words, Vaughn kissed her, a kiss that contained all his promises for their future, all his gratitude for her faith in him, and all his wonder at finding love when he least expected it. Later, as snow fell silently outside their window and Ruby slept peacefully beside him, Vaughn reflected on the journey that had brought them here. He had gone to the orphanage seeking only practical help, convinced the frontier was no place for sentiment or attachment. He had been wrong in the best possible way. Ruby stirred, her hand finding his even in sleep. Vaughn pulled her closer, marveling at how perfectly she fit against him, how completely she had transformed his understanding of what made a home. The ranch would still demand everything they had. The frontier remained unforgiving, the future uncertain. But they would face it together, not as guardian and ward, but as partners who had chosen each other despite every reason for caution. As dawn approached, Vaughn finally allowed himself to fully embrace the truth he had fought for so long. Love wasn't weakness but strength. It didn't make the frontier more dangerous, it made survival more worthwhile. In Ruby's love, he had found not just a wife but a home that would weather any storm. Spring came early that year, as if nature itself approved of their union. The valley greened with new grass, calves dotted the pastures, and the ranch hummed with purposeful activity. Ruby moved through her days with a confidence that drew admiring comments from visitors. No longer the orphaned girl or the guardian's ward, she had become Mrs. Xander of Spring Creek Ranch, a woman whose quiet competence and genuine kindness earned respect throughout the territory. Vaughn, watching her direct the planting of her kitchen garden one warm April morning, marveled at the transformation in his life. The ranch was thriving, the herd expanding, and plans for a larger house were underway. But more importantly, the bitter loneliness that had defined his existence for so long had vanished, replaced by partnership so natural it seemed impossible he had ever lived without it. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching sunset paint the valley gold, Ruby took his hand and placed it gently on her still flat stomach. "We'll need that extra bedroom sooner than we planned," she said softly. Vaughn went still, his eyes meeting hers in stunned question. Ruby's smile confirmed what her words suggested. "By Christmas, if my calculations are correct." For a moment he couldn't speak. Then he gathered her close, his face buried in her hair, overwhelmed by joy so intense it bordered on fear. "A family," he finally managed, "our family. The one neither of us thought we'd have," she agreed, her arms tightening around him. "Are you happy, Vaughn?" He pulled back to look into her eyes, this woman who had walked into his life and rewoven the fabric of his existence with threads of love and possibility. "I never knew happiness like this existed," he said truthfully. "You've given me everything I didn't know to ask for." Ruby's answering smile held all the promise of their shared future, the children they would raise, the ranch they would build, the life they would create together on this land they both loved. As darkness settled over Spring Creek Ranch, Vaughn Xander held his wife close and thanked whatever fate had led him to that orphanage on a crisp autumn day. He had gone seeking household help and found instead the missing piece of his heart, a love strong enough to overcome the hardships of frontier life and heal the wounds of the past. The orphan girl had indeed captured his heart, and in doing so, had shown him that the greatest courage wasn't found in facing the wilderness alone, but in opening oneself to the transformative power of love.